You're listening to Trek FM.
Want to join in the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners' discussion group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field, and we look forward to seeing you there. The 602 Club proudly presents Snyder Cuts, a Zack Snyder Directorial Podcast, and I am just one of your hosts here, Matthew Rushing, and with me, as he is every single week on this epic journey, John Mills.
Yes, I am here. I am ready for battle, my captain. I'm ready to charge into the battle of this podcast and prove my worth on the battlefields of Snyder Cuts.
Excellent, excellent. And it's going to be a big episode, I think, maybe the most quintessential Zack Snyder film we've talked about thus far, 300. We're going to be diving into that blood-filled, joy-filled, and exuberant-filled comic adaptation from Frank Miller by Zack Snyder. But before we get into that, just a reminder, you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure you're subscribed to the 602 Club feed. That makes sure that you get Snyder Cuts as well as the 602 Club. Follow us on Twitter, please do, at the 602 Club. We're on Instagram at the 602 Club TFM. You can find us on Facebook, facebook.com/TrekFM. Got the listeners-only discussion group, the Babel Conference, where you can talk to listeners all over the world. And, of course, Trek.fm is our main hub for every show that we're doing here on the network, as well as all the things you can find. And want to say a quick thank you to everybody who supports us through Patreon. Please, it is a big deal. It costs so much money for what we do here on the network. So please go to patreon.com/TrekFM. See how you can be part of our team. We're revamping everything to make our contribution levels even better. But again, honestly, if you like what we do, it's all ad-free here, folks. So we need listeners just like you to make sure it keeps coming to you. So again, that's patreon.com/TrekFM. John, I was kind of interested to start this one with this, which is, how did you find 300? Was this a movie that you ended up seeing in the theater? Was this a movie that you saw later on? Where did you first experience 300?
Saw it in the theater with my brother. My brother's a lifelong comic book collector, and as his little brother, I'm a lifelong comic book stealer. And I had never read 300, but my brother was very hyped about it. I'd seen a trailer, and I was like, that looks really interesting. And my brother said, oh, the comic is great. I want to see what this plays like. And I remember the movie theater we saw it in. I remember where we sat in, like the section of the theater and everything. And I remember seeing it. And I remember the smile on my brother's face as he watched it. I remember the smile on my face. I remember how much fun we had with it. And that was my first exposure. And I was one of those people that came out of the theater saying to everybody, you got to go see this thing. This is crazy. This is a crazy, entertaining movie. You've got to go see it. This is so much fun. And that was my first encounter with it. And I've returned to it many times through the yeers. And who doesn't know this movie at this point, right? I mean, how did you come to it? Did you see it in the theater?
That's so I knew, obviously, that you would ask, and I honestly can't remember. That's the thing. Like, it's one of those things that I can't remember if I saw it in the theater or not. I feel like that I did, but I just don't know. But this is definitely a movie that I have returned to over the years and seen, again and again. And of course, too, I think of returning to it every time, like the Blu-ray come out, returning it to it then, it had the DVD before. And then, of course, now returning to it here, I returned to it in the 4K edition. So, especially every time there's a new format, it's a movie like this, it's great to see in the best quality that you can. And so that's always, it's one of those benchmark movies, like, what does that look like on, that format? And so for you too. You mentioned your brother had read the comic. Had you ever read the comic at all?
Not before I saw it. No.
Okay.
So I went in as clean as possible. Now, I've always been a Frank Miller fan. I mean, anybody who grew up even tangentially reading comics, especially in my age range, you wound up like Frank Miller with Batman Year One and The Dark Knight Returns. Once those happened, I mean, never mind his run on Daredevil, never mind his run, like he just has been legendary. He was just like Alan Moore. It was like if you put his name on it, you were interested, you were going to see it. Garth Ennis occupied the same space when he came along. It was like, oh, hey, Garth Ennis is writing something. I'm going to read that. So Frank Miller, that's basically all you had to say. It's based on a Frank Miller comic book. I'm like, okay, I'll go see it. And although not everything that that was adapted from a Frank Miller comic book worked out perfectly, but hey, had its hits and misses. But no, so like that's the funny thing is I was a comic book fan, and I've always found it's really interesting because there seems to be this lane that this movie occupies where I have encountered people where their attitude is, oh, well, you're a comic book fan. Of course you liked it. You read it. You went and saw it. And it's just like the comic book and stuff like that. But no, I may as well have not ever read it because I hadn't. I was familiar with Miller's work. Zack Snyder, I knew the name because of Dawn of the Dead. And we talked about that last episode. I wasn't in love with it, at the time and everything. But I was like, okay, I'll give it a shot. It looks interesting. It looks good. And, that's the thing for me, right? This is a very ambitious movie. This is a very visually styled, sure of itself movie. It's photographed beautifully and it uses digital technology. I mean, when you think about it, right? I'll get your take on this, right? This is essentially ahead of the curve in terms of the way they have done things with like Avatar or something like that. This is a blue box movie, basically, where so much of this is digitally created and you go along with it because it's not supposed to look 100% real. And so you have that built-in forgiveness of any imperfections. But I think it also, with somebody who is as stylized as Snyder is, it's a terrific thing because of the fact that that digital playground gives him so much freedom to turn it into a living painting that, this is the only way this movie could be made, right? You can't have like a Cecil B. DeMille $200 billion, tons of extras. We're going to actually have, 100,000 people on stage or, in the fields for the charging Persian army or anything like that. You can't do that. And this is the only way this movie is going to get made.
Yeah, it's interesting because, right before this, the year before, Sin City had been adapted by Robert Rodriguez. And, I think it kind of set the stage for how you would do this movie as well. They're done very similarly. Right. And so it's interesting that two of the biggest Frank Miller books, that aren't connected with some other franchise, they're his works, are brought to the big screen and in much the same way. They're shot very similarly.
And you know what? Forgive me. The thing is, I always get them flipped. I always forget that Sin City came out first. In my head, I go back and forth. I always forget which one came out first because they're contemporary. But yes, so a lot of credit should go to Rodriguez for figuring out how to shoot that and be very stylized. But at the same time, Snyder brings his own type of flair to this. There's a very different type of visual vibe to this, and it's the digital filmmaking that gave them both the freedom, sort of thing. But do you ever do that? Do you ever like flip them? Like I always get them mixed up as to which one came out first.
I literally had to look it up to make sure because I thought that Sin City had come out after this, and it hadn't. It was just a year before this. So they sit right next to each other, and they're obviously probably in production. Overlapping each other as well. So I almost wonder if they ever had a conversation, Rodriguez and Snyder, about this, since they're both working with Frank Miller here to bring his vision to life.
Well, you know what? I mean, so long as we're talking about it, let me ask you, Sin City, what Which one of these would you prefer? I give you two copies.
Sin City yet.
You've never seen Sin City?
No,
Okay,
which after seeing
gleefully,
this, it makes me want to go watch Sin City, though, and see how that
I'd be
was
really
done.
interested.
So, yeah.
I'd be really interested for your take on it, because I think you can definitely tell that the source material is, they're pulling from the same author, basically. I think you can definitely tell that. There's definitely a Frank Miller story has certain DNA to it that you can tell. Who it came from, sort of thing.
One of the things that I was thinking of with this movie too, and I was watching some of the behind the scene extras, listening to Zach talk, and one of the things that he mentioned, is they kept the whole idea of the narration, that this is a story being told. So it allows for them to have the narrative license to be able to create the over the top visual imagery that they do. And, the idea that, of course, the narrator is somebody who's smart. He never lets the truth get in the way of a good story. And I think that's what makes this so smart, is that legitimately you feel that as you get into the film, is that we're being told a story. And therefore, the story is somebody's interpretation of what happened. And it allows us to go on this fantastic adventure with these people. And it means that not everything needs to be quote unquote realistic. We don't, this isn't the most accurate representation of Sparta. This isn't the most accurate representation of the Persian army. It is this character who's based in this world's storytelling ability to bring it to life. And obviously he's telling the story because he's trying to inspire people to continue on the battle. So,
right.
To me, I think one of the things that I got immediately from this movie was that Snyder completely understood the material, and that's what helps bring this to life. And what was great was he allows the actors some places where they get to make it up themselves, and then there are those other places where he's legitimately, we're going to do this exact same shot that's in the comic book. And so some places they have the freedom, some places they don't have the freedom, but I think it all plays together really well so that you never can't tell that there wasn't a scene or even a storyline from the comic book, because it all feels seamless.
Sure. Something that always stuck with me was there was a bit of flack that this movie took when it was released. A lot of people were sort of scandalized by the idea that it was so seemingly quote unquote pro-war and it was so, the term didn't exist at the time, but, toxic masculinity, all of that stuff was packaged into this. And it always stuck with me, because getting back to the narration and what you were pointing out was Snyder specifically saying, this is a story a guy is telling. And he said, what we're making here, and I think he said this to the actors, we're making an anti-war movie. The whole point of this story is supposed to be, the framing device is this guy is getting everybody stoked to go out and run it. And most of these guys, especially on the front line, they're going to die. They're going to get cut up. They're going to get all of that stuff. And he is rallying everybody. How are you going to rally everybody up, get them to go nuts, frothing at the mouth, ready to go? You have to tell them a bigger than life legend. You have to go be like Leonidas, go out there and fight the way these valiant men fought. And that's going to get everybody up and going. And it just always struck me, because I think this movie has so much wit and so much cleverness about it that people lose sight of the fact that it's fully aware. It's saying to you, you're being manipulated. And then the wink of the framing device is to, I think psychologically, it lets you as an audience member be okay with that.
Right. Well, and I mean, I was reading, Frank Miller even said, he, obviously this is based off the Spartans, but he only made the Spartans realistic enough to the point where people could still root for them in the story he was telling. So there is a point in which he diverges and he doesn't go any further with the realities of the Spartan way of life. and things that we would find, distasteful these days. And so again, he's also making that storyteller point of view. He is, originally Frank is the narrator who's choosing what to tell, what not to tell, how to tell the story so that you will root for these people in the end, and you'd want them to succeed in their mission. And, that's part of being a storyteller, right? And again, I think you're absolutely right. We choose to give people the ability to root for these characters by letting them know they're being told a story that doesn't necessarily comport with all reality, and therefore you don't have to feel bad for rooting for one side or the other, because this isn't true to nature. If you want that, go pick up a history book about Thermopylae, and that's fine. This is not that. This is, the basics are true, but the rest of this is a fanciful, almost fable-like edition of the story, which I think is great because, we think about that, and this reminds me of, how so many of the stories that revolve around like the Robin Hood legend and all those kind of things, some of those have bases in reality, and yet we tell fables about him because it's fun, and or even the creator of the Vikings show. It's I've been watching Vikings, and Ragnar Lothbrok is a historical character, but we don't know a ton about him because of what we have. We just have a ton of information. So they've created this fable around this character, in this whole series that they've done. So in much that way, I think you're absolutely right. It allows us to be able to enjoy the fable, but not be fooled to thinking that this is... We shouldn't consider this real.
Well, the thing is, also in terms of this type of discussion, the thing that always sort of grates against me is we, the collective we, the amorphous we, the group of entities that we're all a part of, whatever, speaking generally, have a tendency to pick and choose when we care about the accuracy of a story.
It's true.
And our histories, right? Like, I always go back to Oliver Stone, right? You go through his movies and they're, oh, well, this is, if you watch JFK, it's the most hypnotic fever dream of reality that's ever existed. But it's an incredible story and an amazing movie and tremendous editing. Like, everything about it is terrific. But if you're a young kid, like I was, when you see it, you come out of that thinking, oh my gosh, I know who really killed Kennedy, now blah, 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 blah. And it's like, and then you grow up and you're like, oh, okay. All right. That's not quite the way it happened, probably. But any sort of, and then I go back to Shakespeare and it's like, how did Julius Caesar die and what type of guy was he? And it's like, well, honestly, the notion in our head primarily comes from Shakespeare's play. But that's not what it really was. History is a little more complex than that. And it always fascinates me because 300 comes out and everybody's, oh, well, this isn't historically the way that it happened. This isn't how the Spartans really were. Well, of course not. And, it's just a movie and it's a story about history. Even, as brilliant a film as it is, even Spike Lee's X, about Malcolm X, that's a little bit of myth building, a little bit of a hagiography going on there. But that's fine because it's an incredible movie and he was an incredible person. So it's okay to, if you're going in expecting a documentary out of anything from The Doors to 300, then you sort of need to shift your historical lens a little bit and understand, this is a genre. This is legend building. And it's okay to just sort of relax and enjoy the story as it's being told and root for the good guy, sort of thing.
Yeah.
And Leonidas was, the historical Leonidas was probably a jerk. Yeah, probably. But the Leonidas in 300, I would go into battle with him because he seems like a really great dude. Okay. I'll go with him.
And I think that's one thing that I really appreciated about the movie is the way in which it's able to help you see this character for who he is. And his goal is to protect not just himself, but I mean, he does see the greater threat that this Persian Empire is on, Athens and and Sparta and the rest of the city-states there in Greece. That their freedom to be able to choose their way of life and their city-state will be gone, and it will be dictated to them as to how they will live and what they will do, and they will lose the freedom that they hold so dear. And I think, that to me, that's just a classic, that's a classic storyline anyway. This idea of fighting for the freedom to live the way that as a society you choose to live, not having it dictated to you by somebody else.
Right. Even if it's, you go back to Braveheart, right? Like was that what William Wallace was really like? No, but the whole point of the story is that there is, you can't even overlook in 300 the fact that it addresses the idea that you have corrupt people in the government who are doing things that are shaping the way that things are going, and you don't know who's operating in the shadows. And then you know that the people that live on the mountaintop, I always forget the word for them.
I know what you
the
mean,
ones with the oracle. Yeah, it's a weird word, and it's like, huh? But they're disgusting old men, and like the story even says, they're disgusting old men, but Leonidas must follow the customs. It's that idea of, oh, boo, hiss, yeah, oh, it's not fair sort of thing. And so I think that the part of this movie that really gets overlooked is the fact that Leonidas is operating, he's baiting the fight. And you could make an ethical argument that's, oh, well, what he's doing is wrong. He's been told by his government not to do these things. But then in the context of the story, of course, you find out that the people that are working against him are all corrupt and they're on the take.
Right.
And that in and of itself is a classic part of the type of story that you're going to have here. And then you also have, what a brilliant thing to have the villain in this be somebody who insists that people worship him like a god, right. That he is by nature elevated above all others. And the whole point of the fight is supposed to be nobody's elevated above anybody else. We're all people. Even though, even though Leonidas is a king, right? Well, he still has a council that's around him, and he has rules and regulations, and he has obligations and those sorts of things. So I just think it's such a beautifully layered story. And like what I really focused on this time, what really resonated with me, and something that I think gets very easily overlooked, is whether you love his movies or his style or whatever, Zack Snyder gets incredible performances out of his actors. There isn't a bad performance in this movie. There isn't, even the background people are exactly what they need to be. And it's so gorgeous. It's so beautiful to see, because it's such a sign of respect from the actors that the director can get those sorts of performances. And the fact that he got good performances on the whole in Dawn of the Dead, you and I disagree a little bit about, one or two of them there, but like in this is his second feature film, and he gets performances like this from seasoned actors. I mean, that's, like Gerard Butler, he's never getting away from this role. Everybody will see him as Leonidas for his whole career, no matter what else he's in. That's an amazing thing.
Yeah, no, I was thinking about that too. Gerard Butler, obviously, his career has been one of, I think, ups and downs, and this is definitely an up.
Yeah.
He's had some unfortunate incidences with, like the London's Falling type movies. And he's kind of gotten relegated to that, which is disappointing, because here he is so powerful. He's so good. He is King Leonidas. He has the strength, but he also has the vulnerability. And, I think of that wonderful scene with Lena Headey as, they're in bed together, and she's like, what's bothering my husband, and he kind of bears his heart about how he is worried about Greece. He's worried about the fact that he knows what he needs to do, but it means the possibility of losing his position, losing his life, losing his reputation, losing everything, basically, to do what he knows he needs to do. And it's such a vulnerable scene for a guy who the rest of the movie, there's no vulnerability in, you know? I mean, he's the guy who screams, "This is Sparta," and kicks a guy down a well and starts basically like a "come at me, bro" fight with the Persians. You know, so I think you're absolutely right in that. But I mean, then you got David Wenham, who had been in obviously the Lord of the Rings movies, and here he's fantastic as is our narrator and our storyteller. Lena Headey is you know, she's gorgeous, but at the same time has such strength and character. And I really liked that Zack added that storyline for her where she's willing to do whatever it takes to support her husband and the greater good of Greece, regardless of the cost to herself. And I was really appreciative that they gave her more to do in the story.
You know, there's such a beautiful moment between her and Gerard Butler when he's deciding, do I kick this guy down the well?
Yeah.
And he casts this glance back at her, and she gives this little nod of kick him down the well. And like you see it happen. But that's the thing, getting to your point of the vulnerability, right? Is, yeah, he's, I'm tough. Once I'm committed, I'm going to do this thing. But you see that he has this connection with her that if she had said no, bridge too far, he would listen to her. He respected and followed her advice. In that little tiny moment, you can see that they're more than man and wife. They're best friends, and he trusts her implicitly. He knows she'll never steer him wrong. And in terms of everything else, I think that she gets overlooked in this film an awful lot, because to your point about the subplot, it makes you sick to your stomach, everything that happens with her and how much she's willing to sacrifice and endure just to try to get him help. She's so abused and humiliated, and it makes it so satisfying when she gets the comeuppance later.
Yes.
And it's, you know, it's a difficult, like, she has a very difficult scene in this film, and it's played in such a way that it's really affecting. It's really humanizing, and it's never lurid. It's not prurient. It's supposed to be what it is. Mm-hmm. And I think it's handled as delicately as a scene like that can be. And, you know, like, it's not my favorite scene of the movie, but it's supposed to illustrate all of those things we're talking about with her character.
You know, and I think one of the things that I really appreciate about the way in which he does, you know, when he does the love scene between Leonidas and Gorgo, you know, I think it's beautifully framed and it's beautifully captured. You know, this is two consenting adults who love each other very much, enjoying each other to the fullest, right? You know, the beauty of marriage. And so then when you have the scene later on with her and Theron, or you have what I affectionately refer to as the Den of Iniquity and Xerxes' harem, you know, where these things are happening with these people, but it's not necessarily because they want it to be happening. You know, like Xerxes says he's a benevolent god. He says he's wonderful. But yet, you know, these things are happening around him because people feel compelled to perform these acts in front of him because it makes him feel good or happy or whatever. Same thing with what happens with Theron. You know, she allows this to happen to herself because she's doing something that she doesn't want to have happen, but she thinks it's going to help her husband, help the cause, all of these things. And so I think, you know, Snyder's really able to juxtapose all of those things really well. And again, I think it kind of helps you see exactly what it is that Leonidas is worried about losing. It helps you see the beauty that he's worried about going away. If they are under, Persian rule, what's going to happen to our world? What's going to happen to our way of life? What's going to happen to our families? And, all those things. And so I think that's one of those places where I really saw how, different scenes help bring the story together in a really interesting way. I wouldn't normally say that, a sex scene is needed, but the way that it's done here, I think it helps really justify, one, it being in the film, but it helps then juxtapose against those other scenes to help you understand the reason to fight.
Well, and also you have the Oracle, who's basically like a sex slave for the old decrepit men on the top of there's a lot of commentary, I think, that Snyder works into his movies that people can overlook. And I like what you were saying here. He is showing it in all of these different contexts to say, I show it to you this way, it's beautiful. I show it to you this way, it's disgusting. I show it to you this way, it's unsettling. I show it to you this way, it's enraging. But it's all, it's a really waves lapping on the shore. And in terms of losing the way of life, it's really something that I think is a fascinating question to explore, because there is an anxiety that happens for people as they get older and as the world starts changing. And so, there's a discussion to be had about how much anxiety it causes Leonidas, how much anxiety should there be, because the way that it's presented, when, you could easily make the argument, why fight it? Because the ambassadors show up and they say, look, live how you want to live. All we ask is, you kneel and you show your fealty and you just acknowledge Xerxes, right? What's the big deal? But for Leonidas, it's a bridge too far. You bring me the heads of kings that you've killed, and you make it very clear that you're not, your words might be sweet, but you're demanding something that I'm not going to give you, and that I'm sure that we as a people don't want to give. Now, put aside that last comment, but that in and of itself, when you boil it down, if the ambassadors show up without those heads and without talking the big game and simply say, hey, look, we actually don't want anything from you. We just want you to be part of the empire. Live how you want to live. We don't care. That's completely different from their manner. And, I think that's an important thing to talk about, too, is the way you approach Leonidas in the beginning is going to determine the way he reacts.
Yeah, I think that idea of how we, negotiate with people, how we present our case to people is something that's really interesting to pull out of here. And it is something that I think, obviously, it could have been different if they had approached it differently. And, of course, all of world history could have been different, if the Spartans had been approached differently by Persia. We could have been a completely different world. And I think the question that the movie does rightly ask are what are the things that in our lives are non-negotiables, right? Like, what are the things that are our bridge too far? And how do we find what those are? And how do we know when to act and when not to act? And what action to take? I think those are all really important questions. And what is fascinating to me is how I'm finding these movies to be much more relevant now than maybe even when they first came out, because of some of the questions that they're asking, or just the world that they're portraying. Like last week we talked about Dawn of the Dead and this whole idea of like lockdowns and like, being inside all the time and all that kind of stuff and being scared about going outside, all that stuff. This movie, with this idea of like, where do we fight? How do we fight? What do we fight? What are we fighting? Do we fight at all? Those are all questions that we have to continually keep asking. And, we live in a world where it's like people are choosing to act in a certain way, all the time. And our reaction, what is our reaction going to be? What should our reaction be? What's the reaction that, makes things better, not worse, and those are the questions that Leonidas is having to wrestle with. And what's interesting here is that the choice that he makes is that regardless of whether it costs him his life, he's going to do what he believes to be and what he knows to be the right thing, regardless of what anybody else thinks. Like he knows it to be the right thing.
Well, what's interesting too, though, is something else that I thought about, because talking about, responding to what you're saying about, these sorts of questions that you have. I mean, if you really wanted to sort of like pick it apart and have I think a really interesting discussion, if you did want to come at it, you could say Leonidas in this movie basically makes a Gulf of Tonkin decision where he baits the fight that doesn't need to happen. He could have, fought other ways or figured out other things or, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He goes out and he seeks out the fight. Everybody says, don't go fight. No, you're prohibited. Don't do it. And we can sit here and say, well, he did the right thing, but that's part of the manipulation of the movie, right? Is sitting there and saying, well, of course I think he did the right thing because he's the hero and the music swelled and all of those sorts of things. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm saying that like there is enough material here, enough to dig into because of the fact that it is consciously an anti-war movie, that it is consciously saying this is the story being told on the battlefield to hype up the troops. Snyder, I'm absolutely positive, is aware of the fact that you can sit there and you can pick apart those moments and say, well, wait a minute, though, and have those sorts of discussions about it. And Leonidas makes his own error. He turns somebody aside who wants to help. Now, you say, well, Leonidas's reasoning is all that, but couldn't he find something for this guy to do? This guy would have died in battle probably in 20 seconds. But it averts the whole other problem. So Leonidas has his own shortcomings, and you could pick apart why he thinks that and those sorts of things. So I just, all of that to say that I think that there's a lot of philosophically rich territory from any direction. And what I think the tightrope that this movie walks is that it doesn't say that anybody's wrong when they interpret it, right? Where nobody's 100% right, nobody's 100% wrong. And so it gets right at that whole idea that history is more complex than, what you might be seeing on screen. And I know that for one, I mean, after I watched this movie, I was like, oh, I want to learn more about Thermopylae. I know about it, but I hadn't really studied it or anything like that. So I went out and I started looking some other stuff up. And that's kind of a great thing because, yeah, that's what you want to happen. Okay, I want to go out and find out what the real story is. As, all of that to say that I think that there's enough material here to power these sorts of discussions for a long time.
Yeah, and I think I really like your point, that, we have failings in our characters. Even our hero has a weakness, and that is maybe he's too beholden to one ideal when maybe he should be more lenient. The hardness of the Spartan world is also its detriment, right? And it causes them to have a much more difficult time than they needed to have when, they turn away somebody for reasons to which today we would be like you said, really? It just, put the guy in the back and let him, so.
Let him be a scout.
Exactly.
Anything.
What, so, but that ability to give us complexity and nuance in a movie that I think most people don't see any nuance in, they just see it as a sandals and shields swords movie with a bunch of buff guys running around half naked, and I think the the brilliance of this is that it's disguised like that. And I guess if you wanted to take it that way, you could. But there really is a lot more going on in this film than meets the eye. And I think that's the beauty of it. And I think part of that has to do with, we've talked about it, that Zack as a director, he's bringing all these things, and I think we saw that in Dawn of the Dead, and that's continued here. You could just make a zombie movie and have it say nothing and just be cheap thrills, but that's not what it was. This movie could be the same thing. It could just literally be lots of blood and some boobs, and that's not what this is.
No, it isn't. And I think that to get back to Snyder's visual flair, first thing, before I get back to that, I always forget. It's going to be another year or two or whatever, or a couple of years, a few years, until I see it again. And every single time I rewatch it, I will see the gathered group, and I will look at it, and I will say, oh, wait, that's right. Michael Fassbender's in this.
Yes, it's so
Forget
great.
that 100% of the time.
He's
I'm like,
so
come on.
good in this movie, too, in the little bit that
Yes,
he
he is.
has.
Well, I also sit there, I'm like, come on, Magneto, it's their metal shields. You could really do something with this, but whatever. All right, let's write it into X-Men continuity. But anyway.
There you go.
The thing with the visual flair is I want to double back to that, as I think we're sort of like playing things out here, is I will go ahead. I'm just going to ask you if you agree. I suspect that you do. But I don't think that this movie is as successful or as enjoyable in the hands of a different director. I think, or cinematographer. I think that the creative crew on this movie is the whole reason we're still talking about it this many years later. This could have been handed off to somebody who wouldn't have done it this way. And for all of the people that like to come at this and say, oh, well, it just looks like in the comic book brought to life sort of thing, and they stole direct shots out of it. The comic book was basically a storyboard. Okay, so you saw the storyboard ahead of time. Great. I don't think that there was any other approach for this, and I don't see another director doing it this way. And that's why I think no matter what he does, no matter how we feel about his movies coming up, this will always be the touchstone for Zack Snyder. The same way that the Batman movies, no matter what else he does, that Dark Knight trilogy, that is Christopher Nolan's touchstone. That's his breakthrough point. That is the one where you can always go back and play out from there to get somebody in the conversation. This is always going to be, I think, the primary entry point for Zack Snyder.
No, I agree with that. And I think, you mentioned the fact that, Larry Fong is here with him. And I think that makes a big difference as well. He's going to continue working with Zack on Watchmen, Sucker Punch, as well as Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice. And so those are the films that you'll see him in. I didn't know this, but he also did Super 8. So, which we're going to be covering a little bit later on.
He was also the DP for Lost.
Yeah.
The original DP for Lost. Yeah.
So which he has an incredible visual, next to Deakins. I feel like Larry Fong really has a sense and style to the way he shoots things, the lighting he chooses, and obviously it really mixed with Zack and what he was going for here. But you're absolutely right. I mean, Zack wanted to do this even before he got the opportunity. This is a comic he wanted to turn into a movie. And thankfully, they hired him to do it, and I think he was the right choice to make this film. He understands visual style, and he's able to get those visual elements. And one of the things that really I just was watching very carefully is, people make fun of his use of slow motion, and yet you have to be shooting a scene so perfectly to make the slow motion actually work that the amount of work that takes, I don't think people realize. It's not just slowing down a scene. It's like everything about the scene needs to be pretty much perfect for it to work in slow motion. So here, when you're having these characters come at each other and you're having these like really cool movements, but they're going slow, that's not an easy thing to do. It probably takes twice as much work to make sure that everything is perfect. And then, of course, you know, that you can augment things with CGI, but it's still, it takes a ton of work to make that work. And so the way that he is able to compose shots, and again, I mean, I've said this before, I think here when we were talking one of our previous episodes here on Snyder Cuts, but Zack has a visual imagination. You can see it in the work that he's done on all of his films. He does a lot of his own storyboarding. He knows what he wants. In much the same way that, you know, Lucas would get on set and he'd be like, oh, well, let's do this, you know, and like he has a picture in his mind that he's trying to get to. And I think it's really good. And like you said, I do think that this is the cultural touchstone for Zack Snyder. And this is, if there was any movie that's quintessentially Zack Snyder, it is 300, because everything that we'll come to expect from him is here. Like, this is where everything that you would expect from Snyder is here. And I mean, gosh, you know, we talked about Snowstein-Meyer, and you see many of the same types of things he was doing at this completely refined into that. You know, so this is an artist who has finally, I think, completely found what he's going to be in this film. And that's one of the things that makes 300 so special as a movie, you know, for Zack Snyder fans or just movie fans in general. I mean, this is a visually arresting movie. Every frame, every shot, it is pulling you into the story, you know, and you know, I think, again, people, too, don't realize how much work this would have been to... You're shooting all this stuff in a blue box, right? And then you have to make everything else work. And that's a lot of work to do in post-production. And it's a lot of work, you know, for the director's vision to come through. And so I think it shows, for everyone involved, it shows patience, and it shows clarity of vision to make this work on screen, and in so many places where you could like open the comic book and be like, oh man, there it is on screen in live action. You know, that's a neat thing. That's a really neat thing. But at the same time, for it not to be afraid to slightly tweak or add to the story, and that's where you get, like we talked about with Leonidas' wife, you know, adding more to her story and everything to make it even better.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. Before we get to like any sort of ratings, though, I want to ask you, is there anything on this that you would adjust or trim or remove, or anything that you think needed more added to it? No is an acceptable answer, too.
It's such a good
I'm
question.
Just saying.
And I was like running through things in my mind, and, you know, I if anything you could have trimmed, you may have trimmed, you know, the den of iniquity scene a little bit. You know, I don't necessarily know if it needs to be quite, you know, it's not super long, but I don't, you know, brevity is sometimes better in a scene like that. But I think, again, as I talked about earlier, I think it really does have a purpose for showing just how non-freeing this character of Xerxes is. Like, he's not, like, if you notice, everybody has chains on, you know, regardless of whether the chains are cosmetic or, you know, it's supposed to look cool or whatever, like, everybody is in chains. And so even visually, we're being represented here that this is not a life that anybody wants, because it's a life that devolves into you in some way being in chains. And so, you know, no, I can't really think of anything that I would change. I mean, was there anything that stuck out to you that you're like, no, I might have tweaked that, or I might have, you know, moved that around, or, I mean, because I know you're big, obviously, on editing, so.
No, I can honestly say I would even respond to what you were saying about that, is I wouldn't even cut anything from there, just because it is overwhelming. And so it's supposed to be overwhelming. And so you get an appreciation for how overwhelming it is, right? How over the top it is, and why somebody might not be able to resist so much temptation around them when they'd gone without their whole lives, that sort of thing. And one other question that occurs to me, what is your favorite moment from this movie? What's your pull? What's the thing when I say 300 that you go to?
I guess anybody could say the well moment, but I really like, there's two moments. One is where he says goodbye to his wife. They don't even say I love you, but it doesn't need to be said. And then he's sending back his friend to tell the story. And he's like, any message for your wife? And he says, none that needs to be said. And it's such a great, those two moments together are so perfect for this film, and the characters that they are, it's because you could have easily had a director fall into sentimentality in that moment, but Zack, no. He stays true to who these characters are. And so to me, those are because they are linked, that's what I actually think of now.
For me, I always go back to 100% of the time, the first thing that pops into my head is when he looks at the guy and he just stares at him and he says, "May you live a long life." And just the way he delivers that, you're going to have to live with this, what you've done. And I hope that you live, for a very long time, and you have to remember forever what it was that you did. And he's not saying to the guy, go to hell. He's not saying to the guy, I hate you. He's saying, you got to live with this. And that it was wrong. It's such a powerful moment. I love that moment. It's so perfectly delivered. The angle of the camera as Leonidas is looking down, the furtive look down, all of this stuff is so amazing. But, and then parallel with that, I would go just to that well scene, but not the "this is Sparta" moment. But again, that scene where he has that 1 second nonverbal communication with his wife, and she gives him that little nod. Just that idea, in that moment, just in that scene, you get an idea of their bond, and it's so incredible. It's the type of bond everybody wants with the person they love. They want that, and I think that's just really cool.
That's when she was like, "Do it."
Yeah, basically.
Man,
so is there any question what we're going to rate this?
Yeah, I am. So where do you go with 300?
5. This is a movie that should be added to the National Film Registry. This is a movie that is incredibly important to the moment. It's incredibly important to filmmaking. I cannot praise this movie enough. And to borrow a sentiment from another guy that we both know from his time here on TFM, Mike Schindler, right? He always likes to say about certain directors, oh, well, he did X, or she directed Y, or, something like that. He goes, that'll always get me in the door for everything they do afterward. Because of 300, I will always give Zack Snyder another chance. Doesn't matter. Oh, I didn't love that movie. Doesn't matter. This is the guy that did 300. He might hit that magic spot again. So even when I've walked out of other movies and I'm like, I always think 300. And you might say, oh, well, so why would you be excited about his version of Justice League? Is it because you saw the shortcomings in the theatrical? I'm like, no, the theatrical one was uneven and I wasn't nuts about it, but it's all right. It wasn't as bad as everybody says it was. But the reason I want to see his version of Justice League is because he did 300. I want to see what this guy does when he's given everything. When he has the shot to make the movie that he wants to make, I see 300 in my head. I'm like, okay, if you can give him the opportunity to do that, knock yourself out. So where do you end up with it?
Yeah, this is really interesting because when I went to log this on Letterboxd, I had it at 3.5, and I was like,
"Oh dear,
really?" And yeah, I think I'm gonna be with you in the sense that I do think this is a 5-star film, and part of that has to do with the fact that this is Zack fully in his element at this point, and I do think that. Of all of his movies, this is the most quintessential him. But, in many ways, when I look at this movie and the questions it asks and the themes that it has, many of those are going to play out in his other movies. And it's going to, it actually is going to be interesting because we're going to get a lot of the same questions in movies like Watchmen or Man of Steel. Or BVS, of how does a character respond? How does a character do the right thing, and regardless of what anybody else thinks? And it was interesting to me to kind of see how the questions that kind of drive a director drive a lot of his films coming up, and so. That's fascinating to me, and honestly, some of those questions we already saw in Dawn of the Dead, and so it's interesting to kind of see the consistency so far of Zack Snyder as a director in the sense of the topics he likes to cover, the types of movies he likes to deal with, and that we're seeing very different films come out, in the sense of like. Comic book movies, zombie movies, dystopian movies we're going to see later on. It would be fascinating to see how an animated movie plays into all of this, with Guardians of the Gahul. So it's such a fun process so far. And, 300 really is a movie that, in the end, this is the movie, this is the movie that puts Zack on the map. Like, people know that name because of 300. And it's why people started to then pay attention to him. It's going to be really interesting because, John, next week we get into a very, I would say, for some people, controversial movie. But, we get into the fact that Zack Snyder goes next to Watchmen, Alan Moore's incredible comic, and he tries to bring the unfilmable to life, and it's going to be fascinating to see where we both fall with Watchmen, which, unfortunately for 602 Club listeners, you may have already heard my episode on Watchmen that we did here, so don't go listen to that one. Wait till next week on Snyder Cuts where John and I talk about it, because I think it's going to be a really fascinating conversation.
Especially since it's going to be my first time revisiting it in a very, very long time. And I'm going to be diving in with the director's cut. And I can promise everybody that this is the promise of the show from earlier, too. I'm not in the hate Zack Snyder camp, and I'm not in the love Zack Snyder camp. And I can tell you very specifically that as bullish as I've been with 300, my experience with Watchmen originally was not that positive. So, we're going to have a nice, interesting, honest discussion next week.
Yeah, it's what makes this show, so much fun to do. And I can't wait to get there. So if anybody wants to catch up with you, John, just see what else you have got going on, or maybe they would like to talk about a little 300 with you, where can people find you?
Well, gosh, I don't know why anybody would want to talk to me, but if you want to find me online, I'm Kessel Junkie, KESSELJUNKIE, on your social network of choice. My preferred social networks are actually Goodreads and Letterboxd because, it's fun to talk, share movie reviews and book reviews and stuff like that. So there you go. And you can also find me over on the Nerd Party, regularly co-hosting a show called House Lights, where we look at the work of various directors, and also on a show called Aggressive Negotiations, a Star Wars podcast of a slightly different bent than you might be used to. And I co-host that show with my dear friend, Matt Rushing. Go figure.
Which, it's so much fun to do. So I do hope that people will check that out. You can find me on social media platforms under Matt Rushing02. You can find me here on the network, also doing the 602 Club, which is our general geek show, talking about all of the fandoms we love. As we mentioned, we've covered some of the films we're going to be covering here, John and I, but in a completely different way, so I hope you'll check those out. And, of course, you could find me doing literary tracks about the books and the comics of Star Trek, as well as The Orb, about Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Both of those were with Chris Jones. And then on the Nerd Party Network, I am talking about Harry Potter each and every week, one chapter at a time. And as we're recording this, Drea and I are almost done with the series. So it's really cool. It's been a great journey. So I hope that you will check that out. But you know what? Thank you so much for joining us.
And this is Snyder Cuts.